A white teacher slaps two black twin boys in a moment of pure frustration. But the second their shocked voices ring out, "Our dad is your boss," her entire world comes crashing down. She expects to be fired, humiliated, erased. Instead, the powerful principal does something no one saw coming. He gives her one final chance, but at a price that will push her to the edge. As she battles defiant students, a haunting past, and a scandal that threatens to destroy her, one question remains. Can she undo the damage before it's too late? Or will this mistake cost her more than just her career? This is a story of reckoning, redemption, and the unexpected power of forgiveness. You won't believe how it ends. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Sarah's fingers drummed against her steering wheel as she pulled into the Jefferson Middle School parking lot. The morning sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, but she barely noticed the beautiful spring day. Her head throbbed, a dull ache that coffee hadn't managed to chase away. "Just get through today," she muttered to herself, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. Dark circles lurked under her blue eyes, and she quickly dabbed on some concealer. The tight bun at the nape of her neck felt like it was pulling her skin too taut, but at least it looked professional. She gathered her worn leather bag and the stack of ungraded papers she'd meant to finish over the weekend. Bills had piled up instead: mortgage, car payment, credit card statements with red warnings. The divorce had left her finances in shambles, and these days even grocery shopping required careful planning. The hallways were already filling with students as she made her way to her classroom. Their chatter echoed off the lockers, too loud for her sensitive head. A few kids called out, "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore." She managed weak smiles in response. Room 237 waited for her like it did every morning, but today the sight of it made her stomach clench. Third period would bring her biggest challenge: world history with the Carter twins. Just thinking about them made her jaw tighten. The morning crawled by. First and second period passed in a blur of lectures and worksheet reviews. When the bell rang signaling third period, Sarah took a deep breath and straightened her navy blazer. Students filtered in, taking their usual seats. The Carter twins entered last, as always, sliding into their chairs at the back of the room. Their matching red hoodies and identical faces would have made them hard to tell apart if it weren't for their distinct personalities. Jeremiah's serious expression contrasted with Joshua's slight smirk. "Today we're continuing our unit on the civil rights movement," Sarah announced, trying to keep her voice steady. She opened the textbook to the marked page. "We'll be discussing the achievements and lasting impact." "You mean the sanitized version?" Jeremiah's voice cut through the air like a knife. Sarah's fingers tightened on the edge of her desk. "Excuse me?" "The textbook version," Joshua chimed in, leaning forward. "The one that makes it sound like everything got fixed." Heat crept up Sarah's neck. "We're following the approved curriculum." "Why do history books act like racism is over?" Jeremiah pressed, his dark eyes intense. Joshua nodded. "Yeah. How come you didn't mention redlining, Ms. Whitmore?" The questions weren't delivered with outright disrespect, but the challenge in their voices was clear. Other students shifted in their seats, heads swiveling between the twins and their teacher. Sarah forced herself to take a slow breath. "Those are complex topics that go beyond the scope of our current lesson." "But isn't that the problem?" Jeremiah persisted. "Leaving out the hard parts?" "The parts that still matter today," Joshua added. Sarah's headache intensified, pounding against her temples. She thought of Sophia, her beautiful daughter with her copper skin and curly hair, who had faced so many battles before. She couldn't think about that now. "We need to stay focused on the material," she said, her voice strained. "Now, if you'll turn to page 394-. My dad says education isn't just about memorizing facts," Joshua said. "It's about understanding the whole truth." Something snapped inside Sarah. The mention of their father, Principal Carter, the mounting pressure of her personal life, the constant challenges to her authority. It all crashed together like a wave. "That's enough," she barked, but the twins weren't finished. "How can we learn from history if we don't talk about how it connects to now?" Joshua leaned even further forward, his expression earnest but challenging. The next few seconds played out in slow motion. Sarah's control over her class, her emotions, her life slipped away. Her hand moved before her brain could stop it. The sharp crack of palm meeting cheek echoed through the suddenly silent room. Joshua's head snapped to the side. His hand flew to his face, eyes wide with shock. Jeremiah jumped to his feet, chair scraping against the floor. "Our dad is your boss," the twins shouted in perfect unison. Sarah stood frozen, her palm tingling. The fluorescent light seemed too bright, the silence too loud. 25 pairs of eyes stared at her in horror. Someone's pencil clattered to the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. The reality of what she'd done crashed over her. She'd struck a student. She'd struck Principal Carter's son. Her hand trembled as she lowered it to her side. Joshua's cheek bore an angry red mark. Tears welled in his eyes, though whether from pain or shock wasn't clear. Jeremiah had moved to stand beside his brother, both of them looking at her with expressions that mixed anger, hurt, and something that cut even deeper: disappointment. The classroom felt like it was spinning. Sarah gripped the edge of her desk, trying to steady herself. The stack of papers she'd been holding scattered across the floor, but she barely noticed. All she could see was Joshua's face. All she could hear was the twins' words echoing in her head. "Our dad is your boss." She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. In one moment of lost control, she'd done the unthinkable. And now she stood before her class, before Principal Carter's sons, her career and everything she'd worked for hanging by a thread. The hallways of Jefferson Middle School felt endless as Sarah walked through them that afternoon. Every step echoed against the linoleum floors, mixing with the hushed whispers that followed her. Groups of students huddled near their lockers, their conversations dying as she passed. Some pointed, others quickly looked away. "I heard she totally lost it," a girl whispered, not quite quietly enough. "My cousin's in that class. He said the sound was so loud." Another voice trailed off. Sarah kept her eyes forward, her face a mask of forced composure. Her heels clicked steadily against the floor, each step measured and deliberate despite the trembling in her legs. The familiar faces of her fellow teachers disappeared behind classroom doors or suddenly became very interested in their phones as she passed. Finally, reaching her classroom, Sarah slipped inside and locked the door with shaking hands. The familiar space felt different now, hostile almost. The empty desks seemed to mock her, especially the two in the back where Jeremiah and Joshua usually sat. She could still see their shocked expressions, could still feel the sting in her palm. "What have I done?" she whispered to the empty room. Her legs felt weak, and she began pacing, trying to keep herself from collapsing. 5 steps forward, turn, 5 steps back. The motion was mechanical, mindless, but it gave her something to focus on besides the crushing weight of her actions. The classroom clock ticked loudly in the silence. 3:15 p.m. Each minute felt like an hour. She should be grading papers, preparing tomorrow's lesson plans. But what was the point? Would she even have a class to teach tomorrow? A knock at the door made her jump. Sarah froze mid-pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the door's window, she could see Amy, one of the student office aides, holding a small piece of paper. Sarah forced herself to move, unlocking the door with trembling fingers. Amy wouldn't meet her eyes as she thrust the note forward and quickly retreated down the hallway. The paper shook in Sarah's hands as she unfolded it. The message was brief, typed in plain black text, but each word felt like a physical blow. "Meeting with Principal Carter, tomorrow, first thing in the morning." Her legs finally gave out and she sank into her desk chair. The note crumpled in her grip as memories of Principal Carter flooded her mind. His commanding presence in staff meetings, his unwavering dedication to his students, his fierce protection of his children. And she had slapped one of them. The next hour passed in a blur. Sarah mechanically packed up her things, though she barely registered what she was putting in her bag. At 4 p.m., she walked to her car, the parking lot mercifully empty except for a few stragglers. The drive home was surreal. She reached for the radio out of habit but quickly switched it off. The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel as she replayed the moment over and over. Joshua's challenging tone, the fire of anger in her chest, the sharp crack of skin against skin, the collective gasp of the class, their voices, "Our dad is your boss." She pulled into her driveway without really remembering the journey. The house was dark and empty, just like it had been since Tom left, taking half their savings with him. The silence felt oppressive now, amplifying every thought she tried to suppress. Sarah's hand shook as she poured the first drink. The amber liquid burned going down, but it didn't stop the parade of memories. A second glass followed quickly, then a third. "They were disrespecting me," she said to the empty kitchen. Her words slurred slightly. They kept pushing and pushing. But even through the alcohol-induced haze, she knew these excuses were hollow. The clock on her microwave blinked 8:45 p.m. when Sarah finally stumbled to her bedroom. The ceiling spun slightly above her as she lay in bed, fully clothed. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Joshua's face, felt the impact of her hand against his cheek. At 2:30 a.m., Sarah was still awake, staring into the darkness. The alcohol had worn off, leaving behind a headache and crushing guilt. The twins' words echoed in her mind. "Our dad is your boss." 4 simple words that had shattered her world. She rolled onto her side, pulling her knees to her chest. The position reminded her of how Sophia used to sleep, curled up like a little comma. Sophia, who would have been about the twins' age now. Sophia, who she couldn't protect from the cruel words and prejudices of her own family. Sophia, whose absence still felt like an open wound. Tears slid silently down Sarah's cheeks as she watched the minutes tick by on her bedside clock. She knew with absolute certainty that her life would never be the same. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as she approached the main office. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, her stomach doing somersaults. She hadn't managed to keep anything down since yesterday morning, and exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. The school secretary glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Go right in, Ms. Whitmore. They're expecting you." The walk to Principal Carter's office felt like crossing a desert. Each step required immense effort, her legs wobbly beneath her. The early morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah's throat felt dry as sandpaper. Principal David Carter sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, his presence filling the room despite his calm demeanor. His dark suit was immaculate, his posture perfect. To his right, Olivia Carter stood near the window, her arms crossed over her chest. The morning light outlined her silhouette, making her appear almost ethereal, but there was nothing soft about her sharp, calculating gaze. "Please sit down, Ms. Whitmore," Principal Carter said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Sarah lowered herself into the seat, acutely aware of how her wrinkled blouse and messy hair must look compared to their polished appearances. She hadn't been able to focus enough to iron her clothes or properly style her hair. Dark circles ringed her eyes, visible even under her hastily applied makeup. "I assume you know why you're here," Principal Carter began, his voice measured and controlled. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She forced herself to meet his eyes, though it took every ounce of courage she possessed. "Good." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What happened yesterday was completely unacceptable. You struck a child. My child." His words were calm but carried the weight of steel. "I'm so sorry," Sarah managed to whisper. "I don't know what came over me. Save your excuses," Olivia interrupted, her voice sharp as a razor. "We're not interested in them." Sarah's words died in her throat. She gripped the arms of her chair, preparing herself for the inevitable. Her career was over. Everything she'd worked for, gone in a moment of lost control. Principal Carter leaned forward, placing his hands flat on his desk. "I should fire you," he said simply. "It would be the easiest solution. The entire school expects it. The school board would support it without question." Sarah's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear over its rhythm. She waited for the final blow, for the words that would end her teaching career. "But I won't." The words took several seconds to register. Sarah blinked rapidly, certain she'd misheard. What? You heard him correctly, Olivia said, moving to stand beside her husband's desk. Though personally, I'm not convinced this is the right decision. Principal Carter's dark eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her want to shrink into her chair. Instead, you're going to face what you've done. Really face it. Sarah's relief began to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. Something in their expressions told her this wouldn't be as simple as keeping her job. You will mentor my sons, Principal Carter announced, 3 times a week after school. You will help them with their studies, yes, but more importantly, you will learn from them. What? Sarah's voice came out as a squeak. No, I can't. That's not... The boys wouldn't want that. The boys will do as they're told, Olivia stated flatly. Just as you will. But this isn't a negotiation, Ms. Whitmore, Principal Carter cut in. You will not run from this. You will face it head-on, or you will hand in your resignation right now. Sarah's mind raced. Spending hours alone with the twins, after what she'd done, it seemed impossible, cruel even. I don't understand, she said weakly. Why would you want me anywhere near your children? Because running away solves nothing, Principal Carter replied. Because firing you would be too easy, for you and for us. Because sometimes, Ms. Whitmore, the hardest path is the one we need to take. Olivia moved closer, her presence commanding attention. You'll start tomorrow, 3:30 to 5 o'clock every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We'll evaluate your progress at the end of each month. Sarah's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. This couldn't be happening. Surely being fired would be better than this torture. Do you accept these terms? Principal Carter asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a question. Sarah looked between them, searching for any sign of mercy. She found none. Only steady, unwavering determination. Yes, she whispered, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. I accept. Good. Principal Carter stood, signaling the end of the meeting. The boys will meet you in your classroom tomorrow afternoon. Don't be late. Sarah rose on shaky legs, feeling like she'd just signed her own sentence. As she turned to leave, Olivia's voice stopped her. Ms. Whitmore? There was something in her tone that made Sarah turn back. Don't mistake this for an act of kindness. This is about justice and education for everyone involved. Sarah nodded numbly and walked out of the office. The secretary didn't look up this time as she passed. The hallway was starting to fill with early arriving students, but Sarah barely noticed them. Her career wasn't over, but somehow this felt worse. Much worse. Sarah sat alone in room 204, her usual classroom now feeling like an interrogation chamber. The clock on the wall ticked away mercilessly, each second amplifying her anxiety. She had arranged the desks in a small circle, 3 chairs total, hoping it would create a more informal atmosphere. Her hands fidgeted with a stack of worksheets she'd spent half the night preparing. The door creaked open at exactly 2 p.m. Jeremiah and Joshua Carter strode in, matching grins on their faces. Their school uniforms were pristine, ties perfectly knotted, a stark contrast to their usual slightly disheveled appearance. Sarah noticed they'd even polished their shoes. Good afternoon, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Please take a seat. The twins exchanged knowing looks before settling into the chairs across from her. Their movements were synchronized, from the way they pulled out their chairs to how they crossed their arms over their chests. The similarity was unnerving. So, Sarah began, forcing a smile. I thought we could start by... Start what? Jeremiah interrupted, his voice dripping with false innocence. Start pretending you didn't hit my brother? Joshua leaned back in his chair, mirroring his twin's posture. Or start acting like you actually want to teach us anything. Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself of Principal Carter's words. She couldn't lose her temper again. She couldn't give them the satisfaction. I understand you're angry, she said, pulling out the carefully prepared worksheets. But we have an opportunity here to learn from each other. I've created some exercises that focus on... The twins burst into whispered conversation, completely ignoring her. Their heads bent together, occasional snickers punctuating their hushed exchange. Sarah could catch fragments of their words, something about clueless and waste of time. "Boys," she said more firmly, "we need to focus." Joshua raised his eyebrows. "Or what? You'll hit us again?" Sarah's fingers clenched around her pen. "That was wrong of me. I apologize. Now, can we please look at these worksheets? I've included some interesting articles about modern civil rights movements that I think—" "Oh, now you want to talk about that?" Jeremiah's voice was sharp. "Yesterday you just wanted to stick to your outdated textbook." "Yeah," Joshua chimed in. "Funny how a meeting with our dad changed your mind." They high-fived each other, not even trying to hide their satisfaction at her discomfort. Sarah distributed the worksheets anyway, watching as they immediately began folding them into paper airplanes. Her careful research and planning crumpled before her eyes. "This is mandatory," she reminded them, her patience wearing thin. "Our father expects you to teach us," Jeremiah cut in. "But he didn't say we had to learn anything." Joshua nodded sagely, "And we're choosing not to learn from you." They went back to their whispered conversation, occasionally glancing at her and laughing. Sarah felt her face growing hot. She tried another approach. "Look, I know I made a terrible mistake yesterday. I'm truly sorry. But we have to work together now, and—" "We don't have to do anything," Joshua said flatly. "Except show up," Jeremiah added with a smirk. "Which we did." Sarah stood up, walking to the whiteboard. She began writing out discussion points, determined to maintain some semblance of control over the session. Behind her, she could hear the twins' ongoing commentary. "Think she'll make it through the week? Nah, she'll quit before Friday. Better than getting fired, though, right?" More laughter. Sarah turned around, gripping her marker so tightly she feared it might snap. "This behavior is unacceptable. If you won't participate, I'll have to report—" "Report what?" Jeremiah challenged. "That we're not falling for your fake interest in our perspective? That we're not pretending yesterday didn't happen?" "Go ahead," Joshua added. "Tell our dad. Tell him how we're not cooperating with the teacher who slapped me." Sarah's hand began to shake. She set the marker down before she could throw it. The twins watched her every move, their eyes bright with triumph. They knew they had the upper hand, and they were going to use it. For the next 45 minutes, Sarah tried everything she could think of. She attempted to engage them in conversation about their interests. They responded with exaggerated yawns. She tried to discuss current events. They pulled out their phones. She even offered to let them choose the topics for discussion. They suggested why some teachers shouldn't be teaching. By the time the session was scheduled to end, Sarah's head was pounding. The twins had spent the entire time either ignoring her completely or making snide remarks about her teaching abilities, her understanding of history, and her general competence. As they packed up their untouched worksheets, Jeremiah turned to his brother. "Same time tomorrow?" "Wouldn't miss it," Joshua replied with a grin. They walked to the door, their steps perfectly in sync. Just before leaving, they turned back to face her. "See you tomorrow, Ms. Whitmore," they said in unison, their voices carrying a hint of challenge. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Sarah exhaled sharply, slumping in her chair. The scattered paper airplanes, the unmarked worksheets, the empty classroom. It all felt like a battlefield after a decisive defeat, and this was only day one. Sarah walked into room 204 at exactly 8 a.m., her coffee cup clutched tightly in her trembling hand. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from another sleepless night spent tossing and turning, replaying yesterday's disastrous mentoring session. The familiar scent of chalk dust and old textbooks usually brought her comfort, but today something was different. Something was wrong. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Her desk, normally neat and organized with carefully arranged lesson plans and graded papers, was covered in bright red liquid. Fruit punch dripped steadily onto the floor, creating a growing puddle that spread across the linoleum like spilled blood. Her papers, her lesson plans, everything was soaked through with sticky juice. "Oh no," she whispered, setting down her coffee cup with a shaking hand. The sound of snickering from the hallway made her stomach clench. She looked up slowly, already knowing what she would see. Jeremiah and Joshua Carter stood in the doorway, identical grins spread across their faces. They leaned against opposite sides of the doorframe, arms crossed, looking entirely too pleased with themselves. "Oops," Jeremiah said innocently. "Looks like someone had an accident." "Yeah," Joshua added. "Better clean that up before class starts, Ms. Whitmore." More laughter erupted from the gathering crowd of students in the hallway. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to take slow, steady breaths. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. Not again. Without a word, she walked to the supply closet and pulled out a roll of paper towels. Her hands shook slightly as she began sopping up the sticky mess, but she kept her face carefully neutral. Students filed into the classroom, whispering and pointing. Some looked sympathetic, others amused, but Sarah ignored them all. "Everyone take your seats," she said calmly, continuing to clean. "Open your textbooks to page 247. We'll begin in 5 minutes." The twins sauntered to their usual spots in the back, making a show of how slowly they moved. Joshua dragged his chair across the floor with a loud screech. Jeremiah dropped his textbook onto his desk with an exaggerated thud. Sarah continued methodically cleaning her desk, refusing to acknowledge their attempts to provoke her. Her jaw ached from clenching it so tightly, but she wouldn't break. She couldn't. The morning dragged by in a haze of tension. When afternoon finally arrived, Sarah braced herself for another mentoring session. The twins arrived 10 minutes late, dropping heavily into their chairs with dramatic sighs. "Today we're going to work on your civil rights movement essay," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. She placed 2 worksheets on their desks. "These graphic organizers will help you outline your main points." Joshua immediately began tapping his pencil against his desk in a sharp, irregular rhythm. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 tap. The sound grated against Sarah's nerves like sandpaper. "Please stop that," she said quietly. Joshua's response was to tap louder. Jeremiah let out another exaggerated sigh. "This is boring," he announced to no one in particular. "Hey Josh, did you see that new video game trailer?" "Oh yeah." Joshua completely turned away from Sarah, facing his brother. "The graphics look amazing. Dad said maybe we could get it this weekend." Sarah cleared her throat. "Boys, we need to focus on the assignment." They continued talking as if she hadn't spoken, their voices growing steadily louder. "And the multiplayer mode looks sick," Joshua said, still tapping his pencil. "Way better than the last one." "Boys," Sarah tried again, her fingernails digging into her palms. "Your father expects you to complete this work." "Our father," Jeremiah said, finally acknowledging her with a cold stare, "expects a lot of things, like teachers not hitting students." The pencil tapping grew even louder. Sarah felt pressure building behind her eyes, a headache forming from the tension in her jaw and neck. She wanted to scream, to send them to the principal's office, to quit and never look back. Instead, she took another deep breath and held it for a count of 5 before releasing it slowly. The rest of the session continued in much the same way. Every attempt she made to engage them was met with either complete indifference or thinly veiled hostility. By the time the bell rang, not a single word of their essays had been written. Sarah watched them leave, their laughter echoing down the hallway as they disappeared from view. She gathered her things with shaking hands, somehow making it to her car before the tears started burning behind her eyes. Sitting in the driver's seat, she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Her breathing came in short, uneven gasps as she fought to maintain control. The steering wheel felt cool and solid under her fingers, giving her something to focus on besides the overwhelming frustration threatening to consume her. She couldn't do this. She couldn't face another day of their calculated defiance, their deliberate provocations, their constant attempts to make her snap again. But she had no choice. This was her punishment, and running away would only prove them right about her. Sarah closed her eyes, still gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. Her breath fogged the window as she tried to steady herself, tried to find some reserve of strength to face tomorrow. But right now, In the quiet solitude of her car, she honestly didn't know how much longer she could hold on. Sarah walked into the classroom, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, and the usual chatter from passing students in the hallway seemed muffled and distant. The twins were already there, sitting at their usual spots, their matching blue hoodies and identical smirks making her stomach clench. She'd spent the morning cleaning sticky juice from her desk and trying to salvage what she could of her lesson plans. Her shoulders ached from tension, and exhaustion pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. Still, she forced herself to maintain a neutral expression as she sat down across from them. "Let's get started," she said, pulling out their assignment folders. "We need to work on your civil rights movement essays." Joshua leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. There was something different in his eyes today, a gleam that made Sarah's skin prickle with unease. "Hey, Ms. Whitmore," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "Who's Sophia?" The name hit her like a physical blow. Sarah's hands froze mid-motion, the folder suspended in the air. The room suddenly felt too small, too hot. Her chest tightened as if someone had wrapped a steel band around it. Jeremiah's smirk widened. "Yeah, we heard some teachers talking." He tilted his head, studying her reaction. "They said something bad happened to your kid." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a harsh drone that matched the ringing in Sarah's ears. Memories crashed over her like waves. Sophia's bright smile, her curly hair, the way she'd dance around the kitchen while helping make breakfast. The last time she saw her daughter, angry tears streaming down her face as she ran out the door. The phone call that came 3 hours later. Sarah's fingers dug into the wooden desk, her manicured nails leaving half-moon indents in the surface. Her throat felt like it was closing up, but she forced words through it anyway. "You don't scare me," she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. The words came out raw and broken, nothing like her usual controlled tone. The twins' smiles faltered. Joshua sat back in his chair, his cocky expression replaced by something closer to uncertainty. Jeremiah's eyes widened slightly. They clearly hadn't expected this reaction. The calculated cruelty of their usual pranks was one thing, but this was different. Sarah's vision blurred. She could feel herself starting to shake, memories threatening to overwhelm her. Sophia's empty bedroom, the funeral arrangements, the guilt that ate away at her every single day, knowing she should have done more, should have understood better, should have protected her daughter from the very things these boys were now using to taunt her. Without another word, she stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound harsh and jarring in the sudden silence. Papers scattered as she grabbed her purse, but she couldn't bring herself to care. She had to get out, had to breathe. The twins watched, frozen, as she strode to the door. For once, they didn't call after her with some smart remark. They didn't laugh or whisper to each other. They just sat there, their earlier smugness replaced by something that looked almost like regret. Sarah's heels echoed in the empty hallway as she practically ran to the teacher's lounge. She burst through the door, grateful to find it empty. Her hands shook as she made her way to the coffee maker, going through the motions automatically. Filter, grounds, water. The familiar routine helped ground her, even as her mind spun with memories she'd tried so hard to suppress. Now she sat in one of the worn armchairs, clutching a coffee cup she hadn't taken a single sip from. The liquid had long since gone cold, but she barely noticed. Her eyes stared unseeing at the wall, where cheerful motivational posters seemed to mock her current state. She felt untethered, like she was losing her grip on everything, her composure, her authority, her control. The careful walls she'd built around her grief were cracking, and she didn't know how to stop it. Sophia's face kept flashing in her mind, her beautiful daughter who'd faced so many of the same challenges these twins dealt with every day. Sophia, who she'd failed to protect when it mattered most. The coffee cup trembled in her hands as she continued to stare blankly ahead, lost in a maze of painful memories and overwhelming emotion. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as she made her way to Principal Carter's office. The setting sun painted the corridor in shades of orange and gold, but she felt no warmth from its dying light. Her hands were clammy and her heart thumped against her ribs like a trapped bird. The secretary's desk was empty. Everyone else had gone home. Only a few cleaning staff remained in the building, their vacuum cleaners humming in distant classrooms. Sarah paused at the heavy wooden door, took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," Principal Carter's deep voice called out. Sarah pushed open the door. The office looked different in the evening light, more intimate, more threatening. Principal Carter sat behind his desk, his face carefully neutral. Olivia Carter stood by the window, arms crossed, her sharp eyes following Sarah's every move. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Have a seat, Ms. Whitmore." Principal Carter gestured to the chair in front of his desk. Sarah lowered herself into the chair, keeping her spine straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She waited for the axe to fall, for them to tell her they'd changed their minds about firing her. Instead, Principal Carter studied her face for a long moment. "Why are you so angry, Ms. Whitmore?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. The question caught her off guard. She'd expected accusations, complaints about her handling of the twins, maybe even a termination notice, but not this. Not this simple question that somehow felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. What could she say? That the twins were impossible? That they were deliberately provoking her? All her ready excuses suddenly felt hollow. Principal Carter leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, his eyes sharp and knowing. "What is it you're really fighting? Because I don't think it's my sons." Sarah's throat went dry. She could feel Olivia's gaze boring into her from across the room. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching out like taffy. "I just want to do my job," Sarah finally managed, her voice tight. "I'm trying to teach, but your sons—" "My sons," Principal Carter interrupted smoothly, "are 12-year-old boys testing boundaries. What I want to know is why they get under your skin so easily." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. "They're disruptive, they challenge everything I say, they vandalized my desk. And you slapped one of them." Olivia spoke up for the first time, her voice calm but cutting. "That's not a normal response from a seasoned teacher." "I've already apologized for that," Sarah snapped, feeling heat rise to her face. "I know it was wrong." "Knowing it was wrong and understanding why you did it are two different things," Principal Carter said. He sat back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "You're an experienced teacher, Ms. Whitmore. You've handled difficult students before. What makes this different?" Sarah felt trapped. The office seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in. "Nothing makes it different. I'm tired. It's been a difficult year." "Has it?" Principal Carter's voice was gentle now, almost understanding. "Or has it been a difficult few years?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew he was thinking about Sophia. The twins had made sure of that, but she wasn't going to go there, not with them, not with anyone. "I don't see how my personal life is relevant," she said stiffly. "Everything is relevant when it affects how you treat your students," Olivia said, "especially when it leads to violence." "I'm not violent." Sarah pushed herself up from the chair, her hands shaking. "One mistake. I made one mistake, and now you're acting like I'm some kind of monster." "No one called you a monster, Ms. Whitmore." Principal Carter remained seated, unfazed by her outburst. "We're trying to understand." "There's nothing to understand," Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "I'm doing the best I can." "Are you?" Olivia asked quietly. "Or are you running from something?" Sarah felt the words like a physical blow. She grabbed her purse from the floor, needing to escape. "I don't have to listen to this. I've apologized. I'm doing the mentorship. What more do you want from me?" "We want you to look in the mirror, Ms. Whitmore," Principal Carter said. "Really look." Sarah turned and yanked open the office door. "I'll see you tomorrow," she managed through gritted teeth, then fled into the hallway. Her heels clicked rapidly against the floor as she practically ran to her car. The parking lot was almost empty now, the last traces of sunlight fading from the sky. She fumbled with her keys, dropped them, picked them up with trembling fingers. Finally inside her car, Sarah gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps. She could still hear their voices in her head, their questions cutting through her carefully constructed walls. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, a tiny voice in the back of her mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't just them, but her. She sat there in the growing darkness, clutching the wheel, trying to quiet the thoughts she'd been running from for so long. Sarah sat alone in her dimly lit living room, the ice in her whiskey glass clinking softly as she swirled it. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made thoughts too loud to ignore. The amber liquid caught the faint light from the single lamp, creating dancing shadows on the wall. She took another sip, letting the burn of alcohol slide down her throat. It didn't help. Nothing helped anymore. The twins' words from earlier that day echoed in her mind. Who's Sophia? They had no idea how deep that question cut, how it reopened wounds she'd spent years trying to bandage over. Sarah's eyes drifted to the hallway closet. She knew exactly what was in there, hidden away in a cardboard box she hadn't touched in 3 years. Her heart started beating faster just thinking about it. Another long sip of whiskey. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the glass down on the coffee table. Just do it, she whispered to herself, her voice sounding strange in the empty room. Sarah pushed herself up from the couch, her legs feeling unsteady. Whether from the whiskey or emotion, she couldn't tell. The short walk to the closet felt like miles. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob before finally turning it. The closet light flickered on, revealing stacks of boxes and old coats. But her eyes went straight to it. That plain brown box pushed far back in the corner, covered in a fine layer of dust. She'd labeled it simply, Sophia's Things. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for it. The box wasn't heavy, but it felt like it weighed a ton as she carried it back to the living room. She set it down carefully on the coffee table, disturbing the dust and sending it dancing in the lamplight. For a long moment, she just stared at it. 3 years of avoiding this moment. 3 years of walking past this closet, pretending that box didn't exist. 3 years of running from the pain it contained. With shaking hands, she lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was Sophia's baby blanket, soft yellow cotton with little ducks along the border. Sarah remembered wrapping her newborn daughter in it, marveling at her perfect tiny fingers and toes. She lifted it out carefully, pressing it to her face. It still held a faint trace of baby powder smell, mixed with the mustiness of storage. Underneath lay Sophia's favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Buttons, she'd named him. One eye was slightly loose, and his fur was matted from years of being loved and dragged everywhere. Sarah remembered how Sophia wouldn't go to sleep without him, how she'd panic if they left him at a restaurant or store. The tears started then, blurring her vision as she pulled out item after item. Sophia's first pair of shoes, the ribbon from her 3rd grade spelling bee victory, a handful of seashells from their last beach vacation together. Then she found the photo. It was taken on Sophia's 10th birthday. Her daughter beamed at the camera, gap-toothed and radiant, chocolate cake frosting smeared on one cheek. Her dark curls were pulled back in 2 puffs, and she wore her favorite purple dress. Sarah was behind her, arms wrapped around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something now forgotten. The dam broke. Sarah clutched the picture to her chest and sobbed, deep, gut-wrenching cries that shook her entire body. All the pain she'd bottled up, all the grief she'd tried to drink away or bury in work, it all came pouring out. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry, baby." Sorry for not standing up to her own parents when they made racist comments at family gatherings. Sorry for telling Sophia to just ignore it when classmates pulled at her hair or made cruel remarks. Sorry for not being strong enough, brave enough, present enough. The guilt was overwhelming. It crushed her chest, made it hard to breathe. She'd failed her daughter in so many ways. Failed to protect her from the world's cruelty. Failed to prepare her for the battles she'd face. Failed to be the mother Sophia needed. Sarah slid from the couch onto the floor, surrounded by the pieces of her daughter's life. Mr. Buttons stared at her with his one loose eye. The baby blanket lay crumpled beside her. The photo trembled in her hands as tears fell onto the glass. Her body felt heavy with exhaustion, drained from the force of her breakdown. She leaned back against the couch, emotionally spent. The truth she'd been running from for 3 years sat heavy in her chest. She needed to face this pain. But how? How could she possibly begin to untangle all this grief and guilt? Sarah sat there on the floor, surrounded by memories, feeling more lost than ever. Sarah's car pulled into the empty school parking lot, tires crunching over loose gravel. The morning sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and the building stood silent, a welcome change from its usual chaos. She needed this escape, needed to lose herself in lesson plans and paperwork rather than face the memories that had spilled out of that dusty box last night. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her bag from the passenger seat. Her head throbbed, a reminder of too much whiskey and too many tears. The weight of Sophia's photograph still pressed against her chest, though she'd left it at home on her nightstand. As she approached the side entrance, fumbling with her keys, a voice cut through the morning quiet. "I had a feeling you'd come here today." Sarah froze. Olivia Carter stood by the door, her arms crossed, expression unreadable. Unlike Sarah's disheveled appearance, Olivia looked perfectly put together in pressed slacks and a crisp blouse. "Mrs. Carter," Sarah managed, her throat tight, "I just needed to catch up on some work." "No," Olivia said flatly. "You're running, and we both know it." Sarah's fingers clenched around her keys. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I know about Sophia." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stumbled back a step, her shoulder hitting the brick wall. "How? Does it matter?" Olivia's dark eyes were piercing. "What matters is that you're letting a ghost poison everything around you, including my sons." "You don't understand," Sarah whispered, anger rising to mask her pain. "You have no right." "I understand perfectly." Olivia's voice was sharp as steel. "I understand that you lost your daughter. I understand that she was biracial, that your family couldn't handle it, that you couldn't protect her from their racism. And I understand that when she died, you buried all that guilt so deep it's been rotting inside you." Sarah's vision blurred, her chest felt too tight. "Stop." "No." Olivia stepped closer. "Because that guilt, it won't save you, Sarah. It won't fix my boys either." Sarah flinched as if she'd been slapped. The irony wasn't lost on her. "You look at my sons and you see everything you couldn't save Sophia from," Olivia continued, her words precise and cutting. "You see every failure, every moment you should have fought harder. But they're not your redemption story, they're not your second chance." "I never said," Sarah started, but her voice cracked. "You didn't have to." Olivia's expression softened slightly. "It's written all over your face every time you look at them. But you can't help them until you help yourself. You can't teach them about racism and justice when you're still drowning in your own unresolved pain." Sarah slid down the wall, her legs giving out. The rough brick scraped against her back. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to answer one question honestly." Olivia crouched down, meeting Sarah's eyes. "Do you even know what you're fighting for anymore? Is it justice? Redemption? Or are you just trying to punish yourself?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. Her mind raced through every confrontation with the twins, every moment of anger, every time she'd felt her control slipping. Had she been fighting them? Or fighting herself? She started, then stopped. For the first time in years, she had no defense ready, no excuse to hide behind. Olivia stood, brushing off her slacks. "When you figure out the answer, maybe you'll be ready to actually help my sons learn. Until then, you're just another person letting your pain hurt them." Sarah watched Olivia walk away, her heels clicking against the pavement. The morning sun had risen higher, erasing the shadows from the parking lot, leaving nowhere to hide. The truth lay exposed in the harsh light. She had no answer to Olivia's question, no justification for her actions, no excuse left that could possibly make things right. She sat there against the wall, her bag forgotten beside her, as Olivia's words echoed in her mind. For the first time since that terrible day 3 years ago, she wondered if there was another way forward, not through guilt or anger or pain, but through something else entirely. For the first time, she wondered if she could ever make this right. Sarah walked into the mentorship room, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Her body felt heavy, worn down by the emotional weight of the past few days. The twins were already there, sitting in their usual spots at the back of the room. Their arms were crossed tight against their chests, faces set in identical expressions of defiance. She noticed the small details now, things she'd missed before when anger had clouded her vision. The way Jeremiah's left foot tapped nervously against the floor. The slight furrow in Joshua's brow that suggested concentration rather than just attitude. The careful distance they maintained between themselves and everyone else. The classroom felt different today. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long rectangles of light across the worn carpet. A clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking each silent second. Papers rustled as other students passed by in the hallway, their muffled voices a distant reminder of the world beyond this room. Sarah took her time settling into her chair, arranging her things with deliberate care. She could feel the twins watching her, waiting for her to start their usual battle of wills. But today, she didn't pull out any worksheets, didn't launch into any lectures about respect or responsibility. Instead, she simply sat there, hands folded on the desk, and said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a living thing. Joshua's fingers found his pencil, beginning their familiar tap-tap-tap against the desktop. Jeremiah shifted in his seat, the chair creaking slightly. Their eyes darted to each other, then back to her, confusion slowly replacing their usual smugness. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Tap, tick, tap, tick. Joshua cleared his throat. "What's your deal today?" Sarah didn't rise to the bait. She simply shrugged one shoulder, maintaining her calm silence. More minutes passed. The twins' confidence began to waver. They weren't used to this version of Ms. Whitmore, this quiet, unshakable presence that didn't react to their provocations. Jeremiah's foot stopped its nervous tapping. He leaned forward slightly, studying her face. Joshua's pencil stilled. "You're just gonna sit there?" Joshua finally asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Guess so," she replied, her tone neutral, but not unkind. The twins exchanged another look, this one longer and more uncertain. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, but not in the way they'd expected. Their usual tactics weren't working because she wasn't playing their game anymore. The silence returned, but it felt different now, less hostile, more thoughtful. Finally, Jeremiah spoke, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "So, why'd you become a teacher?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She looked up, studying his face for any sign of mockery, but found only genuine curiosity. It was the first time either of them had asked her anything that wasn't meant to provoke or challenge. Something in the air changed. The sunlight seemed warmer, the room less confining. Sarah saw something shift in their expressions, a tiny crack in the defensive wall they'd built so carefully. Not enough to break through completely, but enough to let a sliver of light in. She leaned back in her chair, considering her answer carefully. For the first time since this ordeal began, she saw them not as adversaries to be conquered, but as students trying to understand their world, just like Sophia had once been, just like she herself had once been. The soft glow of the laptop screen illuminated Jeremiah and Joshua's faces as they sat cross-legged on their shared queen-size bed. Their room was quiet, except for the gentle whir of the ceiling fan and the occasional click of the laptop's touchpad. "You think we should?" Jeremiah asked, his finger hovering over the keyboard. Joshua shrugged, but his eyes were fixed on the screen. "We already started being nice to her today. Might as well know what we're dealing with." Their bedroom felt different tonight. Usually at this hour, they'd be playing video games or watching YouTube videos, but something about their interaction with Ms. Whitmore that morning had stuck with them. The way she just sat there, patient and quiet, had thrown them off balance. Jeremiah typed slowly, "Sarah Whitmore News." The twins leaned forward as the search results populated the screen. At first, it was just the usual stuff, teacher awards from years ago, some community events. But then Joshua's hand shot out, pointing at a link near the bottom of the page. "There," he said. his voice barely above a whisper. The headline stood stark against the white background. Tragic car crash kills 16-year-old Sophia Whitmore. Jeremiah clicked the link. The article was from 3 years ago, accompanied by a school photo of a teenage girl with warm brown skin and curly hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her smile was bright and confident, just like their own sisters. "She looks like she could be related to us," Joshua murmured, shifting closer to the screen. They read in silence, their eyes moving quickly over the words. The article described how Sophia had been driving home from basketball practice when another car ran a red light. She died instantly. The story mentioned she was survived by her mother, Sarah Whitmore, and her father, Marcus Rodriguez. "Wait," Jeremiah said, pointing at another link. "Look at this one." They clicked through to a different article, dated a few months before the accident. This one was about a local debate over racial inclusion in their school district. There was a quote from Sophia herself. "As a biracial student, I've experienced prejudice from both sides, sometimes even from my own extended family. But my mom always taught me to stand up for what's right." Joshua's stomach twisted. "Remember what we said about her kid? When we were trying to make her mad?" Jeremiah nodded slowly, his face pale in the blue light of the screen. "We didn't know." They kept reading, clicking through more articles. The picture became clearer with each one. Sophia had been an honor student, captain of the basketball team. She'd organized diversity workshops at her school. She'd been planning to study law at Howard University. "Look at this," Joshua said, his voice thick. He'd found a video clip from a local news story about Sophia's death. They watched as a younger Ms. Whitmore stood at a podium, her hands shaking as she spoke about her daughter. "Sophia was my heart," she said in the video, her voice breaking. "She made me see the world differently. She taught me so much about love, about justice, about being brave enough to face hard truths." The twins sat in heavy silence as the video ended. The room felt colder somehow. "We really messed up," Jeremiah said finally, running a hand over his face. Joshua nodded, closing the laptop slowly. "When we brought up Sophia in class, man, no wonder she looked like that." The darkness felt heavier now. They could hear their parents talking downstairs, their voices a quiet murmur through the floor. Their mom's laugh drifted up, and both boys felt a sudden, sharp appreciation for her presence. "Remember when we got separated in that crowd at the state fair last year?" Joshua asked suddenly. "And Mom was crying when she found us?" "Yeah," Jeremiah replied, knowing where his brother was going with this. "She was only missing us for like 20 minutes, Joshua continued. "Ms. Whitmore, she's been missing her daughter for 3 years. They sat there in the dark, the weight of this realization pressing down on them. The laptop sat closed between them, but the images from their search seemed burned into their minds. Sophia's bright smile, Ms. Whitmore's tear-streaked face at the podium, the mangled car in the accident photos. "And we've been torturing her," Jeremiah whispered, shame evident in his voice. "Putting juice all over her desk, making those comments. We thought we were just getting back at her for the slap," Joshua added, "but we've been way worse." The silence stretched between them again. Outside their window, a car drove past, its headlights briefly illuminating their room before passing on. Neither twin moved to turn on their bedside lamp. Somehow, the darkness felt appropriate for the heaviness in their hearts. "What do we do now?" Joshua finally asked, his voice small in the quiet room. Jeremiah didn't answer immediately. He picked up the laptop and set it on their desk, then sat back down on the bed. The springs creaked under his weight. The laptop screen had gone dark, but the twins remained wide awake, their minds racing with everything they'd learned. The image of Sophia's smile kept coming back to them. A girl not much older than they were, whose life had been cut short. A daughter whose mother now sat across from them every day, trying to hold herself together while they deliberately tried to break her apart. The gravity of what they'd done, especially bringing up Sophia to hurt her, sat like a stone in their stomachs. Their shared bed had never felt quite so large. or the space between them quite so heavy with unspoken thoughts. Neither twin said another word. They just sat there thinking as the night grew deeper around them. Sarah stepped into the mentorship room, bracing herself for another battle. Her shoulders were tense, her lesson plans clutched tightly against her chest like armor. But as she pushed open the door, something felt off. The usual snickers and eye rolls were missing. Jeremiah and Joshua sat quietly at their desks, books already out. Their expressions were different today, thoughtful, almost hesitant. Sarah paused in the doorway, thrown off balance by this unexpected shift. "Good afternoon," she said cautiously, walking to her desk. She waited for the sarcastic responses, but none came. "Hi, Ms. Whitmore," they replied in unison, their voices lacking their usual edge. Sarah set her materials down slowly, studying them. The twins weren't making eye contact, instead focusing intently on their open textbooks. Their shoulders were slightly hunched, none of their usual defiant posturing present. "Well," Sarah said, clearing her throat, "should we pick up where we left off yesterday?" The twins nodded. Sarah blinked, still adjusting to this strange new dynamic. She began reviewing their assignment, half expecting some kind of elaborate prank, but the boys actually took notes. They answered questions when called on. They didn't whisper to each other or make snide remarks. About 20 minutes into the session, Sarah noticed Joshua fidgeting with his pencil. Not the aggressive tapping from before, but nervous movement. He kept glancing at his brother, who gave small nods of encouragement. Finally, Joshua took a deep breath. "So, what was she like?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's hand froze mid-sentence on the whiteboard. Her chest tightened as she realized exactly who they meant. The marker squeaked against her grip. For a long moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Memories she'd kept locked away threatened to overflow. Sophia's laugh echoing through their old house, her wild curls bouncing as she danced around the kitchen, her fierce opinions about everything from music to politics. Sarah slowly set the marker down, her fingers trembling slightly. She turned to face the twins, who watched her with genuine curiosity and something that looked almost like concern. Sarah's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "She was a lot like you two, actually." The twins exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this response. "What do you mean?" Jeremiah asked softly. Sarah pulled up a chair, sitting down heavily. She questioned everything, challenged everyone. She never accepted simple answers. A sad smile tugged at her lips. She drove her teachers crazy sometimes. Joshua shifted in his seat. Did she look like us?" Sarah's heart ached. Yes and no. Her father was black, like yours. She had beautiful brown skin and the most amazing curly hair. She paused, lost in memory. But she had my eyes. Blue, like mine. "How old was she?" Jeremiah's voice was barely above a whisper. 16, Sarah replied, her throat tight. She was 16 when... She couldn't finish the sentence. The silence that followed felt different from their previous standoffs. It was heavy with understanding, with unspoken pain. "We're sorry," Joshua said suddenly, about bringing her up before. "We didn't know." "We were just trying to make you mad," Jeremiah added, shame evident in his voice. Sarah took a shaky breath. "I know. And I'm sorry too. For everything." She met their eyes directly. "Especially for hitting you, Joshua. There's no excuse for that. None." Joshua nodded, absently touching his cheek where she'd slapped him. "Dad says everyone makes mistakes. It's what you do after that matters." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill. She blinked them back. "Your father is a wise man." "She would have been mad at you," Jeremiah said thoughtfully, "for hitting us." A tear escaped despite Sarah's efforts. Yes, she would have been furious. She wiped it away quickly. Sophia had a very strong sense of justice, like you both do. "Tell us more about her," Joshua requested, his voice gentle. Sarah hesitated, her hands fidgeting with her skirt. She hadn't said Sophia's name out loud in years, had barely allowed herself to think about her. But sitting here, looking at these two boys who reminded her so much of her daughter's spirit, the words started to come. She loved history too, Sarah began, but she always wanted to know the whole story, not just what was in the textbooks. She'd spend hours doing extra research, finding different perspectives. She smiled at a memory. Once she rewrote an entire chapter of her history book because she said it was too whitewashed. The twins grinned at that, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest. The weight she'd carried for so long didn't feel quite as crushing. "What else?" Jeremiah prompted. Sarah wiped her hands on her skirt, surprised to find that talking about Sophia didn't feel unbearable anymore. It hurt. Yes, it would always hurt. But there was something healing about sharing these memories, about letting her daughter live again through stories. Sarah stepped into her classroom early Thursday morning, the familiar scent of chalk dust and old books filling her nostrils. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty desks. She adjusted the papers on her desk, straightening them for what felt like the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote the day's topic on the blackboard: the Great Depression, social impact. The chalk scratched against the surface, echoing in the quiet room. Students began trickling in, their chatter filling the space. Sarah kept her eyes on the board, but her attention was focused on the door, waiting for the inevitable disruption that usually accompanied the Carter twins' arrival. The familiar sound of their footsteps made her pause, but instead of the usual dramatic entrance, no slammed doors, no loud comments, no snickering, Jeremiah and Joshua simply walked in. They made their way to their seats, pulled out their notebooks, and sat quietly. Sarah nearly dropped her chalk. A few students noticed too. Emily Martinez's eyes widened as she nudged her friend Katie. Marcus Thompson actually turned around in his seat to stare. Whispers rippled through the classroom like a gentle breeze. "Are they sick? What's going on? Did you see that?" Sarah pretended not to notice, though her heart was racing. She continued writing on the board, her letters slightly steadier now. When she finally turned to face the class, she half expected to see the twins plotting something, but they sat there actually looking at her, their expressions neutral. The morning lesson went surprisingly smooth. When Sarah asked questions about Herbert Hoover's presidency, Joshua raised his hand, not to challenge her, but to actually answer. When she mentioned the bonus army, Jeremiah asked for clarification without a hint of sarcasm in his voice. The other students kept stealing glances at the twins, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it never did. Later that afternoon, during mentorship, Sarah found herself in an entirely different atmosphere than she'd grown accustomed to. The twins sat across from her, but the usual tension was missing. Their shoulders were relaxed, their usual defensive postures gone. "So," Jeremiah said, opening his textbook, "about the Depression? You mentioned something about Hoovervilles?" Sarah blinked twice before responding. Yes, they were shanty towns named after President Hoover. People who lost their homes during the Depression built them. "Like homeless camps today?" Joshua asked, his voice thoughtful. "Exactly," Sarah replied, surprised by the genuine interest. History often repeats itself in different ways. They worked through the material, the conversation flowing naturally. No snide remarks, no attempts to derail the discussion. Just learning. After about 30 minutes, Joshua cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitmore?" Sarah looked up, expecting the peaceful moment to shatter. "Yes? Did Sophia?" He hesitated, glancing at his brother. "Did she like history too?" The question caught Sarah off guard, but this time, it didn't feel like a weapon. There was genuine curiosity in his voice, maybe even a hint of care. Sarah felt her lips curve into a small smile. She did, actually. She used to say history was like one big story that never ended. She loved learning about the civil rights movement especially. She paused, remembering. She wanted to be a lawyer someday to fight for people's rights. The twins exchanged a look Sarah couldn't quite read. "She sounds smart," Jeremiah said quietly. "She was," Sarah replied. her voice soft but steady. Very smart. And stubborn, too. When she believed in something, she wouldn't back down. Joshua's lips twitched. Kind of like us? Sarah found herself chuckling. Yes, exactly like you two. They spent the rest of the session actually working on their assignments. The silence that fell between conversations wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, almost peaceful. Sarah found herself relaxing in her chair, something she hadn't done during these sessions before. When the final bell rang, the twins packed up their things without rushing. They stood up, adjusting their backpacks. Jeremiah headed for the door first, but Joshua lingered behind. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking uncertain. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "See you tomorrow, Ms. Whitmore." Sarah blinked, her hand freezing mid-motion as she reached for her coffee cup. That was the first time either twin had addressed her without adding some sort of insult or sarcastic tone. No, Ms. Winemore, or Ms. Bittermore, or any of their other creative variations. Just Ms. Whitmore. Joshua hurried after his brother before she could respond, leaving Sarah standing there, her coffee forgotten, as something that felt surprisingly like hope bloomed in her chest. Sarah arrived at Jefferson Middle School earlier than usual, the morning sun barely peeking over the horizon. The hallways were quiet except for the distant hum of the janitor's vacuum cleaner. She unlocked her classroom door, flicked on the lights, and settled into her chair with a steaming cup of coffee. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders felt relaxed. The constant knot of anxiety that had taken up residence in her stomach had loosened. She took a long sip of coffee, savoring the warmth and richness instead of gulping it down desperately like medicine. She pulled out her lesson plans, humming softly as she reviewed them. Today's topic was World War II homefront efforts. Her fingers traced over the notes she'd made, and she found herself actually looking forward to teaching it. The first bell rang and students began filing in. Sarah watched them enter, greeting each one with a genuine smile. When the Carter twins walked in, they nodded at her, not exactly friendly, but not hostile either. It felt like progress. "Good morning, class," Sarah said, standing at the front of the room. Her voice was clear and confident. "Today, we're going to discuss how Americans at home contributed to the war effort." She began the lesson, explaining about victory gardens and rationing. To her surprise, Joshua raised his hand, not to challenge her, but to ask a real question. "Did Black Americans participate in these programs too?" he asked, his tone curious rather than confrontational. Sarah nodded, grateful for the opening. "Absolutely. In fact, many Black communities organized their own victory garden initiatives. They faced additional challenges due to segregation, but they still contributed significantly to the war effort." Jeremiah leaned forward in his seat. "Like what kind of challenges?" "Well," Sarah said, warming to the topic, "many rationing boards were segregated, making it harder for Black families to get their fair share of supplies. Despite this, Black communities often organized neighborhood cooperatives to share resources. The discussion flowed naturally from there. Other students joined in, asking questions and offering insights. Sarah found herself enjoying the back and forth, especially when the twins contributed thoughtful comments rather than barbed remarks. When the bell rang, Sarah felt energized rather than drained. She gathered her materials for the afternoon mentorship session, actually looking forward to it for once. The twins arrived on time, settling into their usual seats across from her desk. But today, they pulled out their books without being prompted. "So," Joshua said, opening his textbook to the chapter they'd been discussing in class, "can we talk more about those neighborhood cooperatives?" Sarah blinked in surprise but quickly recovered. "Of course. I actually have some primary source documents we could look at." She pulled out copies of wartime newsletters from Black communities, and soon they were deep in discussion. Jeremiah pointed out interesting details in the photographs, while Joshua asked insightful questions about the impact on families. At one point, Sarah made a slightly corny joke about Victory Garden vegetables, and to her absolute shock, Jeremiah actually laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, more of a chuckle really, but it was genuine. The sound made her pause, a warm feeling spreading in her chest. They worked steadily through the session, the conversation flowing easily between history and its modern implications. There were no snide comments, no power struggles, no tension-filled silences. Just learning and discussion, the way it was supposed to be. As they packed up their books, Joshua hesitated. "Ms. Whitmore? Thanks for explaining about the cooperatives. That was interesting." Sarah smiled, trying to keep her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Thank you for asking about it. You both made some excellent observations today." The twins exchanged a quick glance before heading out, but Sarah caught something in their expressions she'd never seen before, a hint of respect. After they left, Sarah sat at her desk, letting out a long breath. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the classroom. She looked around at the familiar space, the maps on the walls, the rows of desks, the blackboard still covered with today's notes, and felt something shift inside her. For the first time since the incident, since this whole mess began, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could fix this. Not just survive it, but actually make something good come from it. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She gathered her things, humming softly as she organized papers and straightened desks. Other teachers poked their heads in to say goodbye, and she found herself responding with genuine warmth rather than forced politeness. The drive home felt different too. She didn't need to grip the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She didn't feel the need to replay every moment of the day, analyzing what went wrong. Instead, she found herself thinking about tomorrow's lesson, about new ways to engage the twins, about possibilities rather than problems. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah realized she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Pure, simple contentment. The kind that comes from a day well spent, from progress made, from hope taking root. She grabbed her bag from the passenger seat, a small smile playing at her lips. For the first time in a long time, she was looking forward to tomorrow. Sarah stepped into her classroom early Monday morning, a small smile playing on her lips. The past few days had brought unexpected progress with the twins. Their conversations during mentorship had become almost pleasant. She set her coffee down on her desk, appreciating how the morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the empty desks. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Probably another parent email, she thought. But when she glanced at the screen, her heart stopped. The notification showed a Twitter link shared by one of her students. The headline glared up at her: "White teacher slaps black students and still has a job." Her hands trembled as she clicked the link. The grainy video, clearly shot on a student's phone, played before her eyes. There she was, her face contorted with anger, hand striking across Joshua's cheek. The sound of the slap seemed amplified in the recording. The twins' shocked expressions, their unified cry, "Our dad is your boss." Sarah sank into her chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The video already had thousands of views, hundreds of shares. Comments poured in by the second. "This is absolutely disgusting. How is she still teaching? Jefferson Middle School needs to answer for this. Fire Sarah Whitmore." The bell rang, startling her. Students began filing in, their usual morning chatter oddly subdued. She felt their eyes on her, saw them checking their phones, whispering behind their hands. Even students who weren't in her class walked slowly past her door, peering in with undisguised curiosity. "Ms. Whitmore?" A student raised their hand. "Is it true what they're saying online?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her throat felt desert dry. By second period, the hallways buzzed with tension. Teachers who normally greeted her warmly suddenly found reasons to look away or duck into their classrooms. The school secretary, who had always been friendly, barely met her eyes when Sarah stopped by the office. During her free period, Sarah's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Local news outlets were picking up the story. Parents were sharing the video in community groups. Each notification felt like another nail in her professional coffin. She locked her classroom door during lunch, unable to face the staff room. Sitting at her desk, she scrolled through the mounting social media storm. What kind of person hits a child? This is why we need to protect our black children in schools. Racist teacher caught on camera. When will this end? Principal Carter needs to explain why she wasn't fired. The comments seemed endless, each one a fresh wound. She thought about how far she'd come with the twins, how they'd finally started to trust her. Now this video threatened to destroy everything. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to eat her lunch, but the sandwich tasted like cardboard in her mouth. She couldn't stop thinking about Sophia, about all the times she'd failed to protect her daughter from racism. Now here she was, caught on camera being exactly the kind of person she'd once despised. The afternoon dragged on in a blur of whispers and sidelong glances. Even her most talkative students sat quietly, stealing glances at their phones under their desks. The twins weren't in class today. Probably for the best, she thought bitterly. At 2:45 p.m., her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voice message from Principal Carter. His voice, usually so measured, carried an edge she'd never heard before. "Ms. Whitmore, we need to talk today." Sarah stared at her phone, feeling the walls closing in. The small progress she'd made, the tiny steps toward redemption, all of it seemed to crumble around her. The viral video had exposed her worst moment to the world, and now she would have to face the consequences. She sat there, surrounded by empty desks and the weight of her actions, waiting for the final bell to ring. The sunlight that had seemed so promising this morning now felt harsh and exposing, like a spotlight on her shame. Her coffee sat cold and untouched, a reminder of how quickly hope could turn to despair. Sarah gripped her steering wheel, knuckles white, as she pulled into Jefferson Middle School's parking lot. The usual morning quiet was shattered by a wall of noise that hit her before she even cut the engine. Her hands trembled as she peered through the windshield. Dozens of protesters lined the sidewalk, their signs held high against the pale morning sky. "Protect our children," one read in angry red letters. "Fire the racist teacher," declared another. Local news vans clustered along the curb, their satellite dishes reaching toward the clouds like metal fingers. "I can do this," Sarah whispered to herself, but her voice cracked. She grabbed her purse and teaching bag, taking several deep breaths. The morning air felt thick with tension as she stepped out of her car. The reaction was immediate. Camera flashes exploded around her like lightning strikes. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust toward her face like weapons. "Ms. Whitmore, how do you respond to accusations of racism? Did you target the Carter twins because of their race? Do you think you deserve to keep your job?" A woman with perfectly styled hair and a blazer pushed to the front. "Ms. Whitmore, do you regret hitting those children?" Sarah clutched her bags closer to her chest and lowered her head. She tried to walk faster, but the crowd pressed in. Parents who usually greeted her with friendly waves now shouted accusations. "My child is in your class," a mother yelled. "How can we trust you?" "She needs to go," another voice called out. Security guards finally emerged from the school entrance, creating a path through the chaos. Sarah rushed forward, her cheeks burning with shame. The guards flanked her as she climbed the steps, their presence both a comfort and a humiliation. Inside the school, the atmosphere wasn't much better. Teachers who had been her colleagues for years turned away as she passed. Some whispered behind their hands. Others stared with open disgust. Ms. Rodriguez, who usually shared morning coffee with her, quickly gathered her things and left the break room when Sarah entered. Mr. Thompson, her lunch buddy for 3 years, suddenly found the floor fascinating as she walked by. The journey to Principal Carter's office felt like walking through molasses. Each step was harder than the last. When she finally reached the door, her hand shook as she turned the knob. Olivia Carter stood by the window, her arms crossed, watching the continuing protests below. She didn't turn when Sarah entered. Principal Carter sat behind his desk, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Papers were scattered across his usually pristine workspace. "Sit down, Sarah," he said quietly. She sank into one of the chairs, her legs feeling weak. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the muffled chants from outside. Finally, Carter spoke. "They want you gone, Sarah." Her throat felt dry. "Are you firing me?" "Not yet." He rubbed his temples. "The school board will meet tomorrow to discuss your case. They'll review the video, your personnel file, and—" He gestured toward the window. "All of this." "David," Olivia spoke up, still watching the crowd below. "Tell her everything." Carter sighed. The NACP is involved now. Civil rights groups are demanding action. The superintendent's office has been flooded with calls. Parents are threatening to pull their children from the school. Sarah's stomach churned. What are my chances? Honestly? Carter leaned back in his chair. It doesn't look good. The video is damning. The timing couldn't be worse with all the national attention on similar incidents. The boys, Sarah started, then stopped. What could she say? That they were finally making progress? That they had started to trust her? It all seemed hollow now. Jeremiah and Joshua are staying home this week, Olivia said, finally turning to face her. For their safety. The media's been trying to interview them. Shame washed over Sarah in waves. She had done this. She had put those boys in this position. Go home, Sarah, Carter said gently. There's nothing more you can do today. I'll call you after the board meeting tomorrow. She nodded numbly and stood. The walk back through the school was a blur. More whispers, more stares, more shame. In her car, Sarah sat motionless, watching as protesters continued to march with their signs. Parents took turns speaking to news crews. Someone had hung a banner on the school fence. No place for hate. The morning sun felt too bright, too harsh. She could see her reflection in the rearview mirror, pale, drawn, defeated. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt like she was truly drowning. The small progress she'd made with the twins, the tiny spark of hope she'd felt, it all seemed to wash away under the tidal wave of public outrage. She watched as another news van pulled up to the curb. More reporters spilled out, adjusting their equipment, ready to broadcast her shame to the world. The protesters' chants grew louder, their signs waving like flags in a storm she couldn't escape. Sarah sat alone in her classroom, the quiet settling around her like dust. The clock on the wall read 7:30 p.m., its soft ticking the only sound besides the occasional rustle of paper. Through the windows, the setting sun cast long shadows across her desk, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. She looked around slowly, taking in every detail of the room she'd called home for so many years. The World History Timeline poster she'd carefully laminated and hung during her first year. The quotations from historical figures that lined the walls, each one chosen to inspire her students. The small collection of historical fiction books she'd gathered for her classroom library, their spines worn from countless young hands. Her fingers traced the edge of her desk, feeling the small nicks and scratches that told stories of their own. How many tests had she graded here? How many parent-teacher conferences? How many quiet moments of preparation before the morning bell? With a heavy sigh, Sarah pulled an empty cardboard box from beside her chair. The sound of it scraping against the floor seemed too loud in the empty room. She opened her desk drawer, the familiar squeak making her chest tighten. Inside, years of teaching lay organized in neat folders, lesson plans she'd refined over time, notes from students that she'd kept, special projects that had made her proud. She lifted out a stack of old essays, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. The top essay caught her eye, a paper about the civil rights movement from 3 years ago. The student had written about hope, about change, about believing in better days ahead. Sarah's own comments in red ink praised the optimism, the understanding of history's arc toward justice. Some teacher I turned out to be, she muttered, setting the essays in the box. More memories surfaced as she continued packing. The year her class put on a living history museum. The time a struggling student finally understood a difficult concept, their face lighting up with comprehension. The countless small victories and setbacks that made up a teaching career. She found an old class photo tucked into a folder. Young faces smiled back at her, full of promise and possibility. Her throat tightened as she remembered their names, their stories, their dreams. Had she made a difference? Had she helped shape their understanding of the world? Or had she just perpetuated the very problems she claimed to teach against? The next drawer held supplies, paper clips, sticky notes, dried-out markers, simple things that suddenly felt heavy with meaning. Each item represented a lesson planned, a concept explained, a connection made. Or maybe they just represented her failures, her biases, her mistakes. Sarah paused, holding a stack of blank worksheets. Should she even bother taking these? Should she fight to keep her job, to prove she could do better? Or was it time to walk away, to admit that maybe she wasn't the teacher she thought she was? The protests outside the school echoed in her memory. The angry faces, the accusatory signs, the disappointment in her colleagues' eyes. Could she ever recover from this? Should she even try? She slumped in her chair, suddenly exhausted. The half-packed box sat on her desk like a question mark. Fight or flight? Stay or go? The decision weighed on her like a physical thing. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Sarah turned, expecting to see a janitor or maybe another teacher. Instead, Jeremiah and Joshua Carter stood in the doorway, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. Her heart skipped a beat. After everything that had happened, after the video, after the protests, what could they want? Were they here to watch her pack up? To make sure she was really leaving? The twins stepped into the classroom, moving with an unusual hesitation. Sarah noticed they weren't smirking or exchanging knowing glances like they usually did. Instead, they looked almost nervous. Jeremiah held something in his hands, an envelope, white against his dark skin. He glanced at his brother, who gave a slight nod. "We wrote something," Jeremiah said, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it. The morning light filtered through Sarah's kitchen window, casting a soft glow on her worn wooden table. Her coffee sat untouched, growing cold beside her as she stared at the envelope the twins had given her the night before. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it, afraid of what she might find inside. The envelope was slightly crumpled at the corners, clearly handled with the casual care of teenage boys. Sarah ran her finger along the sealed edge, her heart pounding against her ribs. She'd barely slept last night, this envelope burning a hole in her thoughts. Taking a deep breath, she finally slid her finger under the flap and opened it. The paper inside was notebook paper, complete with the ragged edges from being torn from a spiral binding. The handwriting alternated between two distinct styles, one neat and careful, the other more rushed but still legible. The twins had clearly written it together. Sarah smoothed the paper flat on the table, her hands still shaking. The morning sun caught the edges of the paper, making the pencil marks gleam slightly. She began to read. The first words made her throat tighten. As she continued reading, tears welled up in her eyes, blurring the careful handwriting. She had to blink several times to clear her vision enough to continue. "Ms. Whitmore made a mistake, a big one, and we hated her for it." The words hit her hard, but she forced herself to keep reading. Each sentence felt like it was written directly to her heart. But mistakes don't have to be the end of someone's story. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She reached for her coffee cup, needing something to ground her, but her hand was shaking too much to lift it. "We watched her try, and she's not the same person she was that day. We're different too." A tear splashed onto the paper, making a small dark spot near the corner. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not wanting to damage their words. "We were just faces in her class, now she knows us and we know her." The simple truth of those words made her chest ache. She remembered how she'd seen them at first, troublemakers, problems to be managed. Now she saw them as Jeremiah and Joshua, two bright, challenging, complicated young men who had pushed her to face her own demons. "We still don't like her all the time, but we forgive her." Sarah had to stop reading for a moment. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the sob that wanted to escape. The honesty in those words, both the admission that they still struggled with her and the grace of their forgiveness, overwhelmed her. "We want her to stay, because no one grows if we only punish them." The last lines blurred completely as tears filled her eyes again. This time she didn't try to stop them. They rolled down her cheeks freely as she sat there, the morning sun warming her shoulders through the kitchen window. After several long moments, Sarah carefully folded the letter along its original creases. Her movements were deliberate, gentle, treating the paper as if it were something precious. Because it was. This wasn't just a letter. It was a chance at redemption she never expected to receive. She smoothed the folded paper with trembling fingers, then slid it back into its envelope. The clock on her kitchen wall ticked steadily, marking the passing moments as she sat there, processing what she had just read. The envelope sat before her on the table, no longer just paper and words, but a testament to the possibility of change, of growth, of forgiveness. Sarah knew exactly what she needed to do next. Sarah's heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked into Jefferson Middle School's auditorium. Her hands trembled slightly, and she gripped her purse tighter to steady them. The large room, usually empty after school hours, was packed wall to wall with people. The fluorescent lights seemed harsh and unforgiving. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls. Parents whispered among themselves, their faces tight with anger. Teachers sat in clusters, some avoiding her gaze while others stared openly. Local news reporters huddled near the back, cameras ready. At the front of the room, 5 members of the school board sat behind a long table, their expressions grave. Principal Carter stood off to the side, his face unreadable. His wife Olivia sat in the front row, watching everything with sharp eyes. Sarah made her way to the single chair placed in front of the board's table. It felt like walking to an execution. Her navy blue blazer, chosen carefully to look professional, felt too tight across her shoulders. She smoothed her skirt as she sat down, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Board President Margaret Chen cleared her throat. This emergency meeting of the Jefferson Middle School Board has been called to address the incident involving teacher Sarah Whitmore and students Jeremiah and Joshua Carter. Her voice carried through the microphone. We've reviewed the video evidence and gathered community input. The word video made Sarah's stomach clench. That awful moment captured forever, shared thousands of times online. She forced herself to sit straight, though she wanted to curl into herself and disappear. We'll hear from concerned parties before making our decision, Margaret continued. First, we'll take public comments. One by one, parents stood up to speak. Their words hit Sarah like physical blows. She should have been fired immediately. What message are we sending our children if we let this slide? My kids don't feel safe with her in the building. Sarah kept her face carefully blank, though each accusation stung. They weren't wrong. She had made an unforgivable mistake. But sitting here, listening to strangers reduce her entire career to that one moment of weakness felt surreal. A mother near the front stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. My son was in that classroom. He saw everything. How can we trust her with our children after what she did? The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt sweat beating at the back of her neck. The room seemed to be getting smaller, the air thinner. More parents spoke, their anger building on itself. Some brought up statistics about racial bias in schools. Others questioned her entire teaching record. One father demanded to know why she hadn't been arrested for assault. Sarah's throat felt tight. She wanted to explain about Sophia, about her own journey these past weeks, about how working with the twins had changed her. But would anyone even listen? How could she make them understand that the person who slapped Joshua wasn't who she was anymore? After what felt like hours, Margaret Chen spoke again. We've heard from the community. Now the board will discuss the appropriate action. The board members leaned in, speaking in low voices. Sarah could catch bits and pieces of their conversation. Liability issues. Public relations nightmare. Set a precedent. Her future balanced on the edge of their whispered words. She thought about her classroom, about the lessons she still wanted to teach, about the students she hoped to reach. Would it all end here? Just then, Principal Carter stepped forward. His tall frame commanded attention, and the room quieted immediately. Before you make your decision, he said, his deep voice steady, I have something I'd like to read. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. Sarah recognized it immediately, the twins' letter. Her heart skipped a beat. This was written by my sons, Jeremiah and Joshua Carter, he announced, the very students involved in this incident. The room fell completely silent. Even the reporters stopped scribbling in their notebooks. Carter unfolded the paper carefully. His voice filled the auditorium as he read the twins' words. Ms. Whitmore made a mistake, a big one, and we hated her for it. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering their anger, their defiance, their hurt. But mistakes don't have to be the end of someone's story. We watched her try, and she's not the same person she was that day. The silence in the room grew deeper. Sarah could feel every eye on her. We're different too. We were just faces in her class. Now she knows us and we know her. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone coughed softly. We still don't like her all the time, but we forgive her. We want her to stay. Because no one grows if we only punish them. The last words seemed to hang in the air. Sarah gripped the edges of her chair, her knuckles white. She didn't dare look up, didn't want to see the reactions on people's faces. The silence stretched on, heavy with meaning. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, loud in her ears. Whatever happened next would change everything, but she knew, deep in her heart, that she wasn't the same woman who had walked into that classroom weeks ago. The twins' words had proven that. She closed her eyes and waited for the board's decision. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel of her parked car, her knuckles white against the black leather. The school parking lot was quieter today. No protesters, no news vans. Just the usual morning bustle of students being dropped off and teachers arriving for the day. But the calm felt deceptive, like the heavy stillness before a storm. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes despite her attempts to cover them with makeup. She hadn't slept much, replaying yesterday's school board meeting over and over in her mind. The angry voices, the accusations, Principal Carter reading the twins' letter. It all swirled together in an exhausting blur. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself, straightening her blue blouse. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her belongings. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The walk from her car to the school entrance felt longer than usual. Students clustered in small groups, their conversations dropping to whispers as she passed. Some openly stared, while others quickly looked away. Sarah kept her eyes forward, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. Inside, the hallways weren't much better. Teachers who usually greeted her warmly now studied their phones or became intensely interested in bulletin board displays. The click of her heels against the linoleum floor echoed uncomfortably loud in the awkward silence that seemed to follow her. Two students jumped apart as she rounded a corner, clearly having been discussing her. "Sorry, Ms. Whitmore," one mumbled, both hurrying away. Sarah's chest tightened, but she kept walking. Her classroom felt like a sanctuary when she finally reached it. She unlocked the door with slightly shaky hands and stepped inside. The familiar smell of chalk dust and old books wrapped around her like a comfort blanket. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patches on the empty desks. Sarah set her bag down and began her usual morning routine, writing the day's agenda on the board, organizing handouts, checking her lesson plans. The familiar tasks helped steady her nerves, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything could change in an instant. She glanced at the clock, 9:15 a.m. Somewhere in this building, Principal Carter had the school board's decision. The thought made her stomach twist into knots. A knock at her door made her jump. It was Mrs. Rodriguez from the classroom next door. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly, the first colleague who'd spoken to Sarah all morning. Sarah attempted a smile. "I'm here," she managed. Mrs. Rodriguez opened her mouth to say more, but the crackle of the intercom interrupted them. "Attention all students and staff," the secretary's voice announced. "Please report to the auditorium immediately for a special assembly." Sarah's heart stuttered. This was it. The halls filled with the controlled chaos of an entire school in motion. Students streamed past her classroom, their excited chatter echoing off the walls. Many shot curious glances through her doorway. Sarah waited until most of the crowd had passed before joining the flow of people. She felt oddly detached, as if watching herself from above. The woman in the blue blouse walking down the hall, her heels clicking against the floor, her future hanging by a thread. The auditorium was already nearly full when she arrived. She made her way to the front row, aware of hundreds of eyes following her progress. The same room where yesterday's board meeting had been held now felt even more intimidating, filled with the entire school population. She sat down, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. The noise level dropped significantly as Principal Carter walked onto the stage. His presence commanded attention without him having to say a word. He adjusted the microphone, the feedback whine making several students wince. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice filling the space. I know there has been a lot of discussion and speculation about recent events at our school. Sarah forced herself to breathe steadily, in and out, in and out. As educators, Carter continued, we have a responsibility not just to teach facts and figures, but to model how to handle difficult situations, how to learn from mistakes, how to grow. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. The school board has carefully considered all aspects of this situation. Carter paused, his eyes scanning the room. They have reached a decision regarding Ms. Whitmore's employment at Jefferson Middle School. Sarah's fingers dug into her thighs. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Carter cleared his throat. Sarah Whitmore will remain employed at Jefferson Middle School. The words hit her like a physical force. She heard gasps and murmurs ripple through the crowd behind her. Someone near the back called out in protest. A few students clapped hesitantly, then stopped. Sarah sat perfectly still, afraid that if she moved, she might wake up and find this was all a dream. She was staying. She still had her job. The relief was so intense it made her dizzy. Through the buzzing in her ears, she heard Carter continuing to speak, explaining something about second chances and growth mindsets. But the details washed over her as she focused on simply breathing. In, outside, in, outside. She was going to keep teaching. She could make this right. She could prove to everyone, to herself, that she deserved this second chance. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor brought her back to the present. Students were standing up, talking excitedly among themselves. Some looked pleased, others angry. A group of parents near the back were gesturing animatedly, their faces tight with disapproval. Sarah remained seated, letting her racing heart slow down. She wasn't fired, but as the initial wave of relief faded, she realized this wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning. The real work, the hard work, was just starting. She closed her eyes and took one more deep breath, steadying herself for whatever came next. Sarah meets with Principal Carter and Olivia, expecting consequences after the school board's decision. Instead, she is given a new role, helping lead a student support program focusing on mentorship and academic guidance. Carter emphasizes that this isn't punishment, but an opportunity for real change, and Olivia hands Sarah a book on racial identity, urging her to continue learning. Sarah realizes this is about more than keeping her job. It's about becoming a better educator. Clutching the book and program documents, she steps into her new purpose, knowing the real work has only just begun. On a quiet Sunday, Sarah receives an unexpected visit from Jeremiah and Joshua. They bring her a framed photo of Sophia they found in an old yearbook, a moment frozen in time before the accident. Holding the frame, Sarah feels an unfamiliar warmth, grief mingling with gratitude. The twins' gesture signifies a shift in their relationship, moving beyond animosity into something deeper. As they leave, she places the frame on her mantle, realizing she can now remember Sophia with love rather than only pain. Sarah enters her classroom feeling lighter, her teaching methods transformed. She fosters discussions instead of rigid lectures, encouraging students to challenge historical narratives. The twins, once her greatest antagonists, now sit at the front, actively participating. Colleagues who once distanced themselves begin to re-engage, inviting her into conversations and meetings. When Joshua jokingly asks if she still thinks they're the worst students ever, Sarah smiles and replies, "Not anymore." A new school year begins and Sarah's approach is unrecognizable from the previous year. Desks arranged in groups, student artwork displayed, and personal stories welcomed into lessons. She encourages engagement, making history feel personal and relevant. When a student offers to share her grandmother's civil rights experience, Sarah eagerly agrees, understanding now that history isn't just in textbooks, it's lived. The twins stop by after school, teasingly checking on their favorite teacher, a full-circle moment that reaffirms her transformation. At graduation, Sarah watches proudly as Jeremiah and Joshua cross the stage. Joshua surprises her with a small gift bag, inside of which is a framed photo of Sophia and a handwritten note. "Thanks for everything, Ms. Whitmore. You're still kinda annoying." but you're all right. Tears fill her eyes as she realizes she is no longer drowning in guilt, but standing in a place of growth and redemption. Holding the photo close, she takes a deep breath, the first that feels truly free in years. If you enjoyed the story of David, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. If you enjoyed the story of David, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.